Hello everyone, I'm back. So as you can see, I have a new hairstyle. Anyways, I hope you will learn a lot from this video. So stay tuned. Alright, so welcome everyone to Module 3 of the Philippine Literature. Alright, so in today's video class, we're going to talk about the four eras in the Philippine literature or the history of the Philippine literature. Well, way back on your module 2, we talk about the pre-colonial period and the Spanish period. Now, on your module 3, in today's topic, we're going to talk about the American colonial period, the Japanese occupation, the era of independence or the rebirth of freedom, and the period of activism in the Philippine literature history. Alright class, so let's talk about the American colonial period. Well, this period happened from 1898 to 1941. So, during this period, Filipinos revolutionists won against the Spaniards. Well, wala na nga sila. So, malamang, iniisip ng mga Filipino na nalo tayo sa revolution natin against the Spaniards. So, here comes the American. Well, on the other thoughts, some others says that hindi naman talaga tayo nanalo. No? Kumbaga, binili naman tayo ng mga Americans from the Spaniards, and the Americans actually won us over Spaniards, not Filipino won against the Spaniards. Anyways, well, during this time, well, we elected General Emilio Aguinaldo as our president, and of course, Filipinos are not so fond of being colonized. So, yun, pumutok na naman ang isang gera against the Americans, and here comes the Filipino-American War. Well, suddenly, we lost, and time must go on, so go na lang, no? And also during this time class, the American period, University of the Philippines was founded along with the other schools around the country, wherein the aim of the Americans, well, is to educate all the Filipinos, especially in terms of making us know how to use the language English. Well, sabi nga nila, for them to easily overtake us or overpower us is for them to know how to communicate with us. No? And yeah, one of the aims of the Americans during that time is to educate all the Filipinos in terms of knowing the language. Ang nangyari, we become literate in English, not only in English, but also literate in terms of Tagalog and Spanish as well. Well, this is a very good period class, no? I must say, during the American colonial period. Kasi during the Spaniards class, well, the Spanish do not allow us to study except if you belong to an elite family. However, during the American colonial period class, Americans let Filipinos learn, no? They let Filipinos be educated from the poorest of the poor, no? Kasi nga, ang pinakang aim nila is to make us learn how to speak English so they can easily communicate with us. And something good about it is natuto tayo ng iba't iba pang bagay aside from learning English itself. The next one is, well, in terms of education, well, English became the medium for instruction. No? Pag sinabi natin medium for instruction, we use English in terms of schooling. No? We use English. Well, not only English, we also use Tagalog and Spaniards or Spanish, in some minor subjects, no, during this period. And since we actually lost in the Filipino-American War, well, sabi ko nga kanina, time must go on, Filipinos started writing again. However, literary works were divided into three categories, no? Well, not actually categories, but we were divided into three groups, no, during that time. Well, the first group is Filipinos who write in English, literary pieces. The second group is Filipinos or writers who write in Spanish. And the third one is writers who write or who wrote using Tagalog language. Well, Filipino writers went into all forms of literature, no? Nagkaroon na tayo ng news reporting. Well, during this time, uso na ang radyo. So, Filipinos are writing radio script na during this time. And of course, flourish in terms of poetry, stories, plays, essays, and novels. Well, katulad nga sinabi ko kanina, Filipinos are educated during this time. So, meaning to say, almost everyone, not 100%, but almost everyone are actually indulged in writing literature. because we are educated. And the writings during this time, well, they are all about the love of the country and the longingness for the independence. Kasi nga, even though that we are actually somewhat free in terms of education, but we cannot erase the fact that we are still under the American colonizers, no? And we feel sad about this because sino ba naman ang gusto, tao na gusto na merong may amo pa sa kanya, no? So something like that. We talk about the three categories or the three groups during the American colonial period, the three groups of writers. First, let's talk about the first group, which is which are the writers who wrote English literature. Well, English writers imitate themes and methods of Americans. No, ano ba yung American methods of writing? Well, basically, Americans are practical, straightforward, and most of their literary works are actually from Great Britain, and most of their literary works are focused on the future. A very good example of this is The Dead Star, no, by Paz Benitez. No, this is actually a story of a man searching for true love. However, he is engaged already, and then suddenly he met someone, and he thought she's the one. No? So parang initsupwera niya yung kanyang ka-engage. No? So dahil sa nangyari yun, initsupwera niya yung ka-engage niyan. Parang tampo-tampo. So parang bakit hindi mo ako pinakasalan pero hindi sila nagkakatuluyan. Tapos ito namang isang na-met niya, na feel niya na sinisira niya yung relasyon, so lumayo siya. So ang ginawa ng lalaki, hinanap niya, something like that. At the end, matanda na sila na nagkatagpuan sila. And the love dies. Wala na yung love. So, yun, Dead Stars. No? So, it is actually an American way of writing since it is actually focused on the future, on what will happen at the end if you actually remove yourself from the track, from the right track, something like that. Other examples are How My Brother Leon Brought Home a Wife, no, and Children of the Ash-Covered Lawn, no, by N.V. Gonzalez. Well, this is actually presents the panorama of Mindoro. When we talk about panorama class, this is the way of living. Parang we are this particular literary piece represents the way of living in Mindoro, something like that. Now, class, let's talk about the literature under Spanish language, no? Or the writers who writes or who wrote the literary pieces using the language of Spanish. Well, writers in Spanish are die-hard fan of Rizal. No? Hindi naman ganun ka dead na dead. Pero most of their works are actually, what you call this, they were inspired by the works of Rizal. A very good example of this is Cecilio Apostol, wherein he is famous for his poem to Rizal, a poem for Rizal. And Fernando Guerrero, Maria Guerrero, who dedicated a poem to Rizal, but he collected the best of his poems in a book called Crisalidas. No? Meron siya mga collection of poem and he created a book called Crisalidas. We also have Jesus Balmori, aka Batikuling. Yung Batikuling ay his pen name. We also have Manuel Bernabe, a lyric poet and a lyric poet, no, and known for his fierceness of his nationalistic spirit. And kasi nga, katulad ni Rizal, alam mo yun, to enlighten the minds of the people. So, kailangan i-impart natin sa heart ng Filipinos yung pagiging nationalist natin. So, something like that, like Manuel Bernabe. And also, we do have Carlo M. Recto, who is famous for his book entitled Boho Los Cocoteros, no? Or in English, Under the Coconut Tree. Well, most of his poem is like or inspired by Rizal. In the collection of his literary pieces, he joined into one book and entitled Boho Los Cocoteros. Right, so time for the writers who wrote using a Filipino language. No, well, Rizal, most of his literary pieces are written using Spanish language. No? And but during the American period, since the Americans allow Filipinos to write using Filipino language also, so the Filipinos are more free to express themselves using our very own language. And one of their inspiration in doing or in writing Filipino literary pieces is the Florante at Laura, the book of Florante of Laura by Francisco Balagtas, and also the Urbana at Felisa of Modesto de Castro. No? It became the inspiration of Tagalog writers, just like what I've mentioned. Well, the theme of the literary pieces are written during this period were all about love of the country and longings for independence. No? Since Filipino language is our native language, it is very good, or it is actually at ease. We are at ease expressing ourselves using Tagalog language instead of other languages. Siyempre, mas masarap nga naman magsulat kapag Tagalog. Parang, kumbaga, parang mas ramdam natin, no? Na nagsusulat tayo kapag we are using Tagalog language. No? Some of the examples, class, is Makata ng Puso, Makata ng Buhay, Makata ng Tanghalan. Well, just to mention some famous Tagalog writers like Lope K. Santos, Jose Corazon de Jesus, Amado V. Hernandez. Yeah, Amado V. Hernandez is a very famous one. He actually got a room in CCP way back then when I was still in CCP, Cultural Center of the Philippines. Valeriano Hernandez Peña and Inigo Ed Regalado, something like that. So those are famous Tagalog writers during that time, or during those time. And you can actually look on your modules class to see more writers and their works. Well, definitely I will include that to your exam. Those other famous Tagalog writers in terms of drama, novels and poets, something like that. Alright, so let's talk about the Japanese occupation. Well, this happened during 1941 to 1945. 1945, I'm sorry. Yun, panahon ng Hapon, kumbaga. This is when the Japanese declared war to US, no? Binomba nila yung Pearl Harbor, no? During 1941. And they entered the World War II, 1941, and they were defeated on 1945. So, during these years, during that time, we are under the Japanese occupation. What happened during the Japanese occupation, especially in the Philippine literature? Philippine literature was interrupted in its development. Kasi nga, class, during the American period, Philippine literature flourished. Why? Well, the Americans allow us to write in Spanish, in Tagalog, and in English. And the Filipinos were educated. Everyone knows how to write and read. So we are actually indulged and encouraged to write literature. No? However, during the Japanese occupation class, Japanese hated Americans so much that they don't want us to use English in terms of communication, in any form of communication, no? In speaking and in writing as well. No? So, because of this, literature was put into stop. Bawal ka magsulat. Something like that. So, instead na mag-develop ang Philippine literature, Filipinos should produce more literature, pero hindi, nangyari yun. It's not developing. Philippine literature in English came to a halt. Pag sinabing a halt, no, parang nasisira or na-stop talaga sila, no? Kumbaga, a sudden pause. Because the Japanese hate the English language. Kasi pakiramdam nila, when you're writing in English class, well, you are actually communicating with the Americans and it will make you a spy for them. No? So parang hindi maganda yun during that war. And of course, Japanese are pursuing or, pushing us to use Nihongo and other language like Tagalog as well, our native language, but except for English language. No? And almost all newspaper in English were stopped except the Tribune and the Philippine Review. Yung mga diaryo, syempre English sila eh. So tama ka na, ayaw nila ng English. Well, even though na nangyari ito, this had an advantageous effect on the Filipino literature. Why? Kasi Filipinos who wrote in English during that time were stopped to write in English. Instead of writing something in English, they wrote, or their way of writing transferred to Tagalog. So salip na magsulat sila ng English, nagsulat na lang sila ng Tagalog. And so, during this time, naging bongga yung mga Tagalog literature natin. Liwayway was placed under strict surveillance until it was managed by a Japanese named Ishiwara. Liwayway class is a newspaper. It is written in Tagalog. So, yun. Filipino literature was given a break during this period, just like what I've told you, class. Many wrote plays, poems, short stories, etc. Topics and themes were often about life in the province. Well, it may sound simple, but it's actually a propaganda wherein Filipino writers during this time wants to show the Filipinos how peaceful their life is without any colonizers. No? So parang propaganda nila yan. Let's talk about the Filipino poetry during this period. Well, just like what I've told you, class, earlier, na-stop nga tayo masyado sa pagsusulat ng literature during this time. Kasi nga, ang allow lang ay yung Nihongo, kaya yung Tagalog lang. However, during this time, since we are occupied by the Japanese, we actually acquire literary piece, way of writing from the Japanese. A very good example of this is haiku. Haiku is a Japanese poem. It is a free verse that Japanese liked. It was made up 17 syllables, divided into 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second has 7 syllables, and the third has 5 syllables. So parang 5-7-5 siya. 3 lines. The haiku is allegorical in meaning, is short, and covers a wide scope in meaning. In Tagalog, class, the Filipinos actually acquired this particular style of writing like haiku, and we use Tagalog language in writing haiku, and we call it tanaga. Tanaga, like haiku, it is short, but it has a measure and rhyme. Each line had 17 syllables, and it also allegorical in meaning. What do we mean by allegorical? So that's your assignment. I will flash that later on. Well, since all English literary works were banned, most of the Filipinos simply translate some English dramas to Tagalog. So napaka-utak talaga ng mga Filipino during this time. No? Since bawal sila magsulat ng English, ang ginawa nila, nag-translate na lang sila ng mga English literary pieces into Tagalog. So Filipinos can enjoy American style of writing during this period. Let's talk about the Filipino short story during the Japanese period. Well, before this class, I want you, class, to read your module in terms of the Filipino drama during the Japanese period. I won't include that on your video since it's very short and easy to understand. Anyways, going back, the Filipino short story during the Japanese period. Well, the field of short story is widened during the Japanese occupation. Why? Short stories is widened. Well, since the Filipinos are only allowed to write in Tagalog, not in English, well, more Filipinos are encouraged to write in Tagalog and more on short story as well. And also, many wrote short stories. Among them were Brigido Batong Bakal, ang ganda ng pangalan, and Macario Pineda, Serafin Ginigundo, Liwayway Arceo, Narciso Ramos, and V.M. Gonzalez. Well, he actually wrote 2 during the American period. Of course, boy pa siya. Alicia Lopez Lim, Ligaya Perez, and Gloria Guzman. And you can actually read that on your module of what are their works. Philippine literature in English naman, class, during this time is, well, it is a dark age for the English literature during this time. Paulit-ulit na lang natin sabihin. Bawal nga kasi ang English during that time. Writings that came out during this period were journalistic in nature. Kasi most of the Filipinos, since they don't like Japanese, and, well, because we are, threatened, we are bullied, we are oppressed by the Japanese, well, most of the Filipinos writes or reports what happened and let other Filipino know what really happened or what is really happening during that time, and somewhat reporting type, so journalistic in nature. Now, let's talk about the era of independence or the rebirth of freedom. Yay! Rebirth of freedom! We're free again! Japanese are gone! Something like that. So, the era of independence. Well, Americans returned in 1945. I shall return. So, MacArthur, tinupad niya yung pangako niya. Dumating siya. So, niligtas daw niya tayo sa mga Japanese. Well, totoo naman. And the Philippines regained its freedom and the Filipino flag waved joyously alone. Ano? So, well, by this time, we are no longer colonized by the Americans. We are declared free from everyone. No more colonizers. During this time, we are a sole country, Philippines. Sabi nila. No? Pero, hindi naman parang ganun nangyari kasi may direct command pa rin sila over the Philippines. So, kapag may gera sa Vietnam, punta mga Filipino. Kapag may gera sila sa Middle East, punta mga Filipino during that time. No? The state of literature during this period, well, struggle of mind and spirit. So, what do we mean by this struggle of mind and spirit? Kasi, we are in a total mess during this time, class, during 1945. Nadala ay mga Filipinos we're threatened we're abused by the Japanese. We can't, yun bang ano, there is no freedom of speech. No? We cannot write anything, especially kapag against sa mga Japanese. So we are actually struggling. No? Kumbaga, we are under the shock. We are under shock pa rin. No? Nandun pa tayo sa age na yon. No? And also, there was a proliferation of newspapers. So, nagusubungan ulit kasi during the Japanese period, pinatigil yung mga newspapers. So, ngayon, nagbabalikan na sila. Filipino writers who had gone abroad and had written during the interims came back to publish their works. Yung mga naglipa na. Kasi yung mga pasaway, ayaw tumigil during the Japanese period. Ayaw nila tumigil sa pagsulat ng mga gusto nila, especially in English. Well, wala sila nagawa kundi umalis sila. And yun, during this time, they came back. And I want you, class, to see some writers and their works during this period. Those writers are included on your module. Please read them and know the writers and their works. Yeah. Well, since we're free and we are back in writing, no? So, poetry in English during this period, well, some notable works of the period includes the following, like Heart of the Island during 1945, the Philippine Cross-Section, the Prose and Poems, the Philippine Writing, the Philippine Harvest, Horizons List, and Speak Not, Speak Also. So, these are these are the famous literary works during these periods, no? Especially written in English. And yes, since we are free again, so not only English is back, but also Filipino literature. So Philippine literature in Tagalog was revived, no? Kumbaga parang panibago na naman ang kanilang tema ngayon. Hindi na sila simpleng nagta-translate lang in Tagalog. Well, most of their writings are about the Japanese brutalities. Newspaper and magazines publication were reopened since, yun nga, pinapasala sila during that time. Short story had better characters and even based on the facts and realities, themes were more meaningful. Well, this is because of what we have experienced during the Japanese period. So, kumbaga, parang we treasure life more. No? That's why it also reflects on the way we write literature. No? Novels became common but were still read by the people of recreation. So, what do we mean by this? Well, kumbaga, dati kasi pag mga novela, big star siya for literature, no? Special siya. Ngayon, ano na lang siya? Everywhere, we can see novels na. People's love for listening to poetic joust increased more than before. Well, since we've won the war, so through the help of the Americans, and we are now, or they were finally free during that time. Well, yung nationalistic spirit nasa kanila pa rin. So, yun. So, kumbaga, mas gustong-gusto pa nilang makinig ng mga Tagalog or Filipino literature during that time. And again, I want you guys to see the published books. They're all available. Not the books, but the information. They're all available on your modules. Now let's talk about the period of activism. Since we are so free, sabi nga nila, well, people are now starting to be thinkers, no? And thinking not only for themselves but also for the entire country. As you can see in the picture, yan, nandyan yung mga kabataang makabayan. This happened during 1970 to 1972. So, well, hindi pa tayo pinapanganak during that time. Bata pa tayo lahat. And anyways, yeah, that is the time when martial law was declared. So, during that time, na nabuo, yung activism na yan. Well, talking about the period of activism, as you can see on the video, we have there the picture of Kabataan Makabayan, and those boys, the 5 men on the picture, they were actually Joma Sison and friends. They are the one, or they are the founding member of Kabataan Makabayan. At yung pinaglalaban nila, yung triangle dyan, yung tatsulok na tinatawag nila. And there, news for Kabataan Makabayan was founded. Now, let's talk about that, the historical background of the period of activism during 1970 to 1972. Well, youth activism in 1970 and 1972 was due to domestic and worldwide causes. No? So, well, since Philippines is so free, no, most of the most of the, what you call this? Mga nasa pwesto na lang, no? They end up being corrupt, no? Kumbaga, so because of this, hindi maganda ang nagiging kalakaran from the entire country. Well, activism arouses from 1970 to 1972. And because of the ill of society, pag sabi ng ill, sakit. So, sinong sakit? Salot. Eh di mga corrupt. So, yun. Kaya nabuo din, one of the reason why activism arouses from that particular period. Some believe that socialism or communism should replace democracy. Well, during this time kasi class, China won their governments, no? They overthrow democracy and became socialist country. At nakita nila there is a revolutionary change on their country. Parang naging mas mabilis sila in terms of industry, workforce, labor, etc., equality. So, most of the students during that time ay naisip nila na, mas maganda yun sa China, bakit hindi natin subukan? So, something like that. Rebel writers were imprisoned during this time. Well, since martial law was declared during 1972, well, rebel writers were imprisoned. Yeah, kasi nga, most of the literary works during that time is rebellious against the current government by that time. And because of that, arousing of the activism, martial law was declared. And because martial law is declared, now you can no longer write anything that is against the government. So you will be imprisoned. No? And youth during this time believe on what Rizal said, that the youth is the hope of the country or of the fatherland. Well, totoo naman, tayo ang pag-asa ng bayan. Pero they took it differently, no? They took it as change in the country in terms of the governance. Yun yung gusto nilang pagbabago no? Change in our governance. And during that time, campus newspapers showed rebellious emotions, especially in UP, no? So talagang rebellious na sila. And literature of the activists reached the point where they stated boldly what should be done to effect these changes, no? Ano ba yung mga gusto nilang palabasin? Ay di humawak ka ng armas, tumungtong ka sa bundok, magrebelde ka against the government. So something like that. So hello everyone, I didn't include the period of the new society since it's also under the martial law, no? So most of the literary pieces during this period is almost the same during the activism or the activist period, wherein the Philippine literature is in progress and progressive. What do I mean by progressive? So palaban during that time, no? So most of the Filipino writers write something against the government and write something for the betterment of the government as well. And you can see your module in terms of what are the examples of literary pieces during the period of New Society. And this is actually the transforming age, no? From the being progressive to modernized up to the present literary works of our time or of our country. So I hope you like this video and stay tuned for or wait for module 4 video. Bye bye.